We're sat here in Oslo with Jørn and Chris from the band Ulver, who've recently celebrated the 10-year anniversary. Could you tell us a bit short about how the band started?
I guess it started as a regular teen band playing, hard metal music in one of our parents' garage. Also, I think the motivation for starting a band was pretty strong at that time due to the black metal thing growing pretty strong in Norway. But there are no deeper reasons. I think when you're at that age, you only want to, just get your groove on, I guess.
If we look a bit at the debut album, how was this album received?
It was overall pretty well received, and the band quite rapidly grew into a significant name in the Norwegian black metal underground, as it was back then. But also during the last years, the album has often been categorized as a classic, a true classic of that period, of the first kind of inklings of the Norwegian black metal scene.
So Bergtatt has been released. It's more or less a traditional black metal album, and then you start transforming the band, start shape-shifting, and Kveldsanger, the follow-up, what would you categorize it as?
I'm not sure what the popular term would be, but I guess it would fall into the new wave kind of amateurish neoclassical genre. But I think that had something to do with just wanting to explore a certain aesthetic that was incorporated into the black metal format. So at that time, I don't think the grand kind of metamorphosis that happened later was kind of, that wasn't envisioned at that time.
Because that's where I wanted to get to with the next album, Nathan's Madrigal, which is even more violent and brutal than the first album. I've heard that it's supposed to have been recorded in the woods. Is this true, or is it just a rumour?
No, I just think that's pure commerce from our label at that time, which was Century Media. They always use these cheap and superficial arguments in order to push their records and stuff like that. So
we could say that you more or less leave that genre and you release the themes from William Blake's Marriages of Heaven and Hell album. This is also the first album that you released through Jester Records, your own label. Why did you want to set up your own label?
I think partly due to what I explained earlier with our kind of feeling of not really being in the right company with Century Media and all this kind of growing commerce around black metal. At that point, the band had grown to a certain level sales-wise and all this, so we kind of knew that we could set up our own label and make it work financially.
The inspiration is obviously William Blake's prose and illustrations. It's almost a rock opera-ish conceptual album where you're blending back and forth through different genres. What sort of reactions did you get?
Well, actually, what I prefer to call the Blake album is commercially speaking the most successful album we've released, like sales-wise, in terms of that. I don't view it as a personal, the personal biggest success, but it did very, very well commercially, and that was kind of funny because part of the argument we had with our former label Century Media was kind of their somewhat negative reactions to the rough material that I sent them. I don't think they believed that would, go home in a metal audience.
Right, so you follow up the William Blake album with the Metamorphosis EP, which in my opinion sums up and glances forward, and also, as it says on the album, acts as an audio trailer for Perdition City. And the final track, Wolves and Withdrawal, sort of goes into territory that the two Silence EPs return to later. When you do these short experiments on albums which stick out a bit, that's not the same as the rest of the album, are they sort of trailers to test what people react to them, or?
I strongly believe that we have a certain Joker mentality. That's always been there.
Which brings us to Perdition City, Music to an Interior Film, which is a very descriptive title for an album which is a mixture of bombastic beats, noir, jazz and vulnerable ambient emotions. So what sort of a place was the band in around this time, and what were the inspirations for Perdition City, which is another step in a different direction?
I think before that album I'd been listening a lot to very minimal music, and kind of stopped listening to sound where everything just comes like a fist in your face all the time. So musically, that was kind of the agenda all the time, to keep it down.
I think maybe the process of making music started taking different directions, probably on the Metamorphosis EP as well, and that kind of you started to work out the music in another way, and it also reflects the outcome in the end.
The whole rebellious aspect turned from being very extrovert to, of course, going straight up our own ass. So it all became a very interior process, and the music, of course, reflects that. So it reflects a lot of personal changes.
Good, because it brings us more or less up to date with the lycanthropian themes, but in between there's the two Silence EPs.
Yeah.
What made you lay aside the vocals? Why did you decide to release two EPs without any vocals on them?
I think that's a continuation of the 180 from extro to intro. So I think those EPs I regard them as studies.
Yeah.
They're not, perhaps as easy to understand for the audience, and that's also why they were quite limited.
Like we just mentioned Lycanthropian, which is the soundtrack to Steve Eriksson's short film. The Lycanthropian themes is quite a powerful and at the same time vulnerable soundtrack. And
yeah, but also by necessity more minimal. I think that's something you very quickly discover when you start to put sound on an actual film, that Perdition City would be too much on top of a movie as Lycanthropian.
So what do you think of the film?
Considering the premises being a very independent film with practically no money, I think the outcome is fantastic. And I think Steve has done a marvelous job. I also think that the film Lycanthropian has a similar or a somewhat related way of envisioning things and the effect of things. The film is also pretty subtle, I think, and I think that's similar to the way we think of music. So that's interesting, that combination. Yeah.
What I like about the movie is the way it's quite concrete. It's very minimal setting, not too much people, and the story is quite simple, and it develops in a very subtle, kind of abstract way. What I don't like about the film is the end. I think it's too overexposed in a way, completely compared to how it evolves. I think it should be subtle all the way.
Apart from receiving good reviews for the album, you also received a nomination for a Norwegian Spellemannpris in the open genre class for the soundtrack to Lycanthropen. I mean, considering the competition that you were up against, there was 3 neo-jazz oriented bands, Samic folk singers. I mean, it was quite serious competition, so I mean, it must have been a great motivator for the band.
It felt okay to be nominated in that class, but apart from that, I perhaps feel that the whole circus around these kind of Grammy awards is it's very coincidental as well.
You've just celebrated the first 10 years as Ulver with a remix compilation called The First Decade in the Machines. It's a very global collection of participants on the album. I mean, there's Third Eye Foundation from England, there's Mersbauer from Japan, as well as Norwegian Upland, who are one of the bands signed to Jester Records. Many bands, including yourselves, seem to have favoured to do remixes of the old trilogy.
I think the distinction there is basically the noise artists took care of the old part of the catalog, whereas the more modern or futuristic sounding of the involved parties took care of more recent sounds.
How does the way you create music today differ from the way you created music in the earlier years?
Not necessarily as much as people think. We prefer to record the real shit, so to speak, if we still can, of course. So most of the drums, at least like 70% of all the drums we use are kind of acoustic drums, at least initially. We're not the total computer geek band yet.
I think the concept of shape-shifting, kind of when Ulver started out, kind of, as you said, kind of uproar in a way. It's quite simple. You have these negations and differences are very easy to spot, and those practicing black metal still are trapped in the same schemes in a way, and it's very easy to pluck it apart. And but by doing all this kind of shiftings all the way, it's not that interesting to be brutal or explicitly black, or it's become more or less a part of the backbone or a way of thinking, and that makes it's not so important to stand out and be so fucking explicit all the way. Just we practice it. We don't know where it's going to take us, but that's not the point.
I do foresee a slight return to something a bit more rock and roll. Not like rock and roll, but just a bit. I foresee kind of going slightly away from the very computer generated feeling towards something, like leaning perhaps a bit more back to the good old way of playing music.
So what lies ahead in the second decade for Ulver? I mean, the Svidnigga soundtrack, we know it'll differ from the Lycanthropen soundtrack, but what can we expect?
Lycanthropen was our first foray into making score music, so and we grew a lot. I think with that process being the first time, we grew further during the making of the score for Svidnigga, which was also or is a feature film which had significantly more money. Necessarily the music is more layered, more orchestrated, more kind of like a slightly more commercial take on score making. I think I see Lycanthropen partly as more experimental, minimal. It's more of a left field kind of project, whereas Svidnigga was commercially fueled from the start, you know. And we had to play a lot more ball as well with all these people involved in that film, and that wasn't necessarily a good experience, but we learned a lot through that as well. So, you know, next time we do this, we know how to, you know, improve and make things even better.
On your webpage there is a sample for the Quick Fix for Melancholy EP. How did this collaboration come around? Because the first thing I thought when I saw it was like, wow, we're going back to William Blake. It's lyrics, it's poetry that we put music to.
We've had the wish doing vocals again in a much more integrated part of the music, and the clip on the net, the sample, is by a Canadian author, which is a beautiful text, which I have been working with in other contexts. And I showed it to Chris, and we decided this is something which can work with the kind of themes and moods in the EP. But that's we also used another by
lyric.
Half a year ago we started writing a lot of lyrics and interviewing ourselves and stuff like that, for making more text to integrate with the music on the next full length.
I think, yeah.
And we used one of those lyrics also on the EP, which we have written ourselves. And
I think there's definitely an ever increasing kind of awareness that text is extremely important, and treating text and writing requires a different insight and a different kind of cleverness, or and that's something, that's a challenge we're kind of taking on now, that we really want to put back some substance into the music through language, through text, you know, through writing. So there ain't going to be bullshit lyrics on the next record, for sure.
The coming album, Utopian Enterprises, where do you plan to take us this time?
We're in the middle of the process right now, so trying to pinpoint what it's going to be is not possible, I think.
Oh, but that kind of.
But we have some ideas and kind of not rules but principles we are trying to incorporate, which are formulated much stronger now than, for example, on the Silence EPs and on the film scores as well. There is music for something else. This is going to be our process fully.
But I think the music is going to support the texts more than the other way around, and some of the magic that happens when we write together, or we something occurs in the studio. It's hard to say why this is good, or why it kind of speaks to us, and it's also extremely hard for us now to know, you know, whether this is going to lead us into extremely narrow kind of listening environments and all this, or go the exact opposite route to you know, something far greater.
All right, Chris, Mio, thank you very much.
No problem.
Our pleasure.